Hello and welcome to another equipment review from the AHF. I'm going to be talking today about the Peter Regeni sabres, which are the bull hilt and similar type of sabres, so the complex hilted sabres that he makes. Just about my personal experiences, the different models. Over time I have used or owned almost every type of sabre that he's made. So I'm going to talk about them all and what I think of them all. I'm going to start off with the one I've had the longest, because after all, that's probably the most significant, and that is now what it looks like. Now, don't let that put you off his swords. This was in fact, or maybe even still is, my favourite training sword of all time. It's been absolutely fantastic, and this one had about maybe 3 years of very, very heavy contact on a regular basis. This was getting 2 to 3 sessions a week, plus weekend events, loads and loads of sparring time at very high contact levels. So it took an absolute beating. So as you can see from the guard, it's had very, very heavy usage. I used it an awful lot. You'll see this on loads of my sparring videos. It's also the one that you'll see me break in one of my sparring videos when I'm fighting Artur. So if you want to see it break, well, I don't particularly like seeing it break, but yeah, you can watch that video. So what have we learned based on the fact that I had this for years and got a lot of use out of it? Well, first of all, its durability was outstanding. Peter, several times I've shown him this sword and he's appalled at, the kind of shape the basket's in, and he said he wants to make them stronger, and he's done tempered guards and things like that. Well, you can see it did eventually start to deform from hits towards the knucklebow section of the bowl, but realistically, by the time this bowl was worn out, and it's still serviceable now and you could just hammer it back out, the sword was absolutely knackered. So I don't think that's an issue at all. They're really nice and strong. So they're thick steel, the edges are rolled so they don't go sharp there, they're nice and strong. Has a nice back strap, which I like, and it's peened rather than threaded, which I also like. This model was made to our club specification. Loosely, it was the what he called the Chrisman blade and back strap, but coupled with the wider ball that he fitted on some of the other models that went to, I believe, Sweden, and also similar to the Eastern model ball as well. But we also then had it a rolled tip, in which case that's the rest of the blade. So you can see we had the tip rolled. So essentially we had a few different bits put together to make our club specification, and we were really, really happy with them. Now, if I show you a complete version, because this is actually the replacement, so this is loosely the same sword. I didn't order this one of my students did, so it's a whisker different. The bowl is slightly narrower, the grip is leather instead of cord wrapped, but it's very, very similar. So if you see me using a bull hilt sabre in the videos at the moment, this is the one I'm using. This is the replacement for that one. Now, what do we think? Well, first of all, don't expect it to flex like a feather does, even though it might look a little bit like his feather range. It's got a rolled tip, it tapers nicely, but it doesn't flex in the same way. It flexes more along the plane of the blade rather than just the tip. So they're really quite rigid. But for this kind of sabre combat, that's reasonably well suited. It depends what you want in terms of flexibility out of a blade. Certainly you'd have to be a little bit more wary on some thrusts with these kind of sabres than you might do with, say, a synthetic or a rapier or something like that, or even the feather longswords. So be wary of the fact that they are a bit more rigid than a feather. They're more in line with what I would call a typical blunt. Then on to the blade itself, durability wise. Well, going back to the one that's absolutely wrecked, you can see, yes, it's bird to high hell, and yet it never really went sharp. I never did any edge maintenance to this one at all. I never ground it down, I never hammered it flat, I never did anything whatsoever. The old clean, and that was it. And you can see I can still run my hand along it and it hasn't gone sharp, which I definitely wouldn't do with a lot of other swords that I've owned. So yeah, although it took edge damage, it never went sharp, it never went dangerous. Really happy with that edge. A few of them did gain a bit of a set, but nothing massive. Not that they had to actually be reshaped sort of like a rapier would be, but as you see, the bowl lasted. Eventually it started to come a little bit loose, the whole hilt, only to a marginal degree, never to the level that I thought was ever a problem. The grip never had any issues. So overall I thought this sword was absolutely outstanding. There's not much I would have done to improve on this, but as I said, it was made to our specification, to what we wanted out of a sword. Now, what do we want out of a sword? Well, at that time we wanted to replicate the kind of Victorian era infantry officers' sabres. which is this is a rifle officer's sword, which is a good example. So the 1827 pattern rifle officer, and this is with the later blade from 1845 onwards, the fuller blade. So we wanted to replicate something like this, which is a kind of typical Victorian era infantry sword, British infantry officer's sword. That's what we wanted to represent. Now most of these that I've ever handled or weighed or seen statistics on, they're all between 800 and about 880 grams. Now I'm sure there are examples outside that range, and in fact I will show you one in a bit that I've got that's outside of that range. But at these kind of dimensions, typical British infantry sword is that kind of range. I've got them going down to 800, and I've got them up to about 860, and I know there's a few a little bit higher than that. So with that in mind, that's what we were aiming for, with light curvature, blade of typical on these is about 32 to 33 inches, and a good bit of hand protection, although as you can see it's not symmetrical. Now we went symmetrical because for a start we've got left and right handed fences, and because you don't wear particularly heavy gloves with those sabres, the thumb is a real risk, so we use a bowl, which was very common historically. Throughout the Victorian period they used cavalry guards, cavalry swords that are bowls, for the practice of infantry combat. They just blunted them down and eventually made it into a gymnasium blunt pattern sword. So that's what we were aiming for. And how did it end up? Well, I would say it was actually a very accurate representation. The length and curvature were near enough perfect. The level of protection to the hand was roughly about right, considering, as I said, we wanted to go symmetrical on the design. And the weight, well, this particular one is 850 grams. The two Regenyis that we've had are 800 grams dead on. As I said, my other similar sword to this is 800 grams, so we're really happy with that. The balance is pretty much bang on. I think that's it's about 5 inches, 12.5 centimeters. So that worked really, really well. So what about the other models that he's done and things that we don't like? Well, this one has a leather grip. Now, the first ever Regeni sabre I had from him, which was one of his prototypes, was a leather grip, and the first time I used it I realised it slipped horribly in the hand. That's not to say you can't get a leather grip working, but you'll need a slightly different shape to the actual grip that you've got, and this doesn't have a lot of shape to it, in which case the cord grips worked way, way better. So the first thing we ever did was request cord, which I would have wanted on this one as well, but somebody else ordered it and sold it on to me. Aside from that, really like it. This one, the bowl's a little bit narrower than my other one, but that's marginal. The balance, the length, the durability, the flexibility, all thought was absolutely fantastic. But comparing it to the other models, first of all, there's the embellished model that he did. That's like a 3-bar hilt, which is triple bar hilt, which is much like a, say, light cavalry sword of the Victorian era, the sort of 1821 pattern, and also the artillery officer swords. So in many ways that is actually very much like an original sword, but you have got the risk of thrusts coming through into the hand rather than the bowl, and also, although I haven't seen them cave in, there is an increased risk compared to the bowl. So a couple of our fences have got the embellished hilt, and that's worked perfectly well, although I don't think he typically rolled the tip. And rolling the tip is incredibly important. I can't overstate that enough, really. That is very, very dangerous if you do not roll the tip. So that's the embellished model, generally good, but make sure you get the rolled tip or put a tip on it yourself. Going on to the other ones that he did, well, the Christman sabre, which is very similar to this one, but has a much narrower bowl. That isn't especially representative of many British sabres, so I wouldn't necessarily have gone for that anyway, so I'm not going to talk about that one. Then there's the Eastern sabre, which is sort of based on the gymnasium pattern sabre. I'm really not a big fan of having screw thread construction on a sabre. I don't like the way it looks, I don't like the way it feels, I don't like the way it rotates in the hand. You've got a nice sort of section of back strap here which sits lovely into the hand, so I just do not like it when you have screw thread with a big nut on the bottom or something like that on this kind of sword. On a rapier, for example, absolutely fine, have a screw thread or a screwed pommel or anything like that. But on long swords and sabres, swords that have a good bit of cutting power, far prefer to have it peened. Now ultimately, yes, that could mean it's going to rattle loose, which this one's got a tiny bit of play in it, but I'd much rather that over the compromise of having a screw thread pommel. And yes, you can change the blades, but going back to this one, my experience is that if the sword is made well enough to begin with, by the time the blade fails, the rest of the sword should be at the end of its life. So I'd much rather have it peened. And the other issue I found with the Eastern models is the guard, or the grip especially, has started to get longer and longer over time. The first ever one I had, which is a prototype, was really quite compact, even smaller than this. And this in itself is quite a large grip. If you just compare it to this 1827 models, you can see the grip and hilt space is really quite large. And that's because increasingly people wanted to get larger and larger gloves in them, things like the Red Dragons and even bigger again. And I think the Eastern models that he's been making are just too large on the grip. I appreciate people might want to use large gloves, but it's compromising the weapon. It's getting heavier and more cumbersome. And I tend to find the longer the grip gets, the slower and more cumbersome the rotations are with the sabre, which is so important. You want a sabre grip to be as short as you possibly can, which is why, you know, for example, the Black Fencer sabres we use, I'd love for the grips to be shorter on those, but I know people want to use big gloves. When you've got a bowl, you do not really need that huge glove. You really just need something with wrist protection and something to the little finger, something like that. So you don't need that massive bulky glove. And I think they just got too large. Which takes us on to the last model to really mention, I suppose, which is the sort of strong sabre, I think he calls it, which is the only one he now sells. And that one has got a tempered guard. And I've said that, but I said this at the start of the video. I don't think you need to temper these guards. I think it's an unnecessary process. These are plenty strong enough by a long way. But the other big issue that I have with them is weight. The current model of strong sabres, they are around about 920 to 940 grams. Now that is really quite heavy for an infantry sabre. It might not seem like much, that it's maybe 50 to 100 grams more than an original. But 50 to 100 grams is an awful lot in sword terms. That's often the difference between an infantry sabre and a cavalry sabre. And to just prove the point, going back to this one, I've got examples, as said, historically, between 800 and 860 grams, classic infantry officer's sword. And to show you an example of something a little bit outrageous in the infantry stakes, this is an infantry officer's sword, but with a cavalry-sized blade. Now, whether that's because it was made for a very large man, or it was made for an infantry officer who was mounted, we'll never know. But the point is that this is a cavalry-sized sword, even though it looks like an infantry officer's sword. Well, it is an infantry officer's sword. And this weighs 960 grams. So you can see this one is pretty much, you know, almost bang on to what Regeni is now making for infantry swords. And that's a beast of a, essentially, cavalry weapon. And most of the cavalry swords do come in the range of about 940 grams to 1 kilo. So the current Regeni sabres are basically cavalry sabres, which I think is a real shame, because they're just too big, too heavy, they hit a little bit too hard, and they are using the grip construction of the Eastern model, which has a very long grip, at least the way he makes it, and that big sort of screw thread sort of pommel section on the end. So the current strong model I'm not a big fan of. It's no doubt going to be robust and reliable. It'll be as strong, as well made as the ones I've got there. In fact, even stronger with the tampered guard or hardened guard. But I just find it's too heavy, too big, and not suited to infantry combat. So I think that about sums it up in terms of the Regenis. Oh, there's a few last points to make. When the Regeni did break, was it a safe break? And the answer is yes. That's as clean as you can absolutely hope for, that it went almost exactly flat. It's just that tiny little bit on the tip. So it was a nice clean break. So I'm pretty happy with that. Last things to say, I suppose. The one thing I can't talk about so much yet is the Polish sabre that he's released. Now the blade on that really does interest me, because it looks exactly like we want to use for Georgian military sabre, which is really nice. But I guarantee that the construction of the guard is going to be a problem, in that the knuckle bow does not connect to the pommel, and it's not especially large either. If you want to have a guard that doesn't connect, if you look at a recent sabre I bought, where the guard doesn't connect down to the pommel or back strap, it will be a massive weakness, because you're getting massive leverage on the knuckle bow. And it's all very well to say you shouldn't parry with the knuckle bow. No, you shouldn't intentionally parry with the knuckle bow, but it's going to get hit from time to time, and that one is going to suffer there. So I would say if you're going to buy the Regeni Polish sabre, I've got faith that the blade's going to be good, but I would take it to a metal worker and have a piece welded from there to there and join it up like this one is. So that's just a little bit about the Polish sabre. Anyway, I think that covers it all, and therefore my conclusion is the Regeni sabres did us some really good service, and they continue to do so, but the current model, the strong sabre, I just cannot recommend. It is not well suited to what we want to do for British infantry sabre. Even though we do a lot of the, say, Georgian period stuff, we also do the Victorian sabre, and I would say it's not well suited to that. It's too much like a cavalry sword. But if he can tweak a few things, I think he could actually get it back in line to the kind of thing that we really, really like, around about 800 to 830 grams, something like that, to be a smaller, faster, and better sabre. So anyway, I do hope the new Polish sabre is going to work out well, even if we have to modify the guard slightly. And I do hope that he can get some of the other ball hilts back into production. For example, if you took his new Polish sabre and put the very narrow Christman bowl on it, you would effectively have a cheap and simple version of the 1803 infantry officer's sword. So that's something I hope we can convince him to do in the future. But right now, yeah, I wouldn't be happy with a sabre from him in its current form. So thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video.